Dear students, today we shall be talking about the nitrogen cycle, which is one of the important cycles among various biogeochemical cycles. Before proceeding, it is my request to you all to like and subscribe my channel BioLearnia. Before knowing about the nitrogen cycle, we must be knowing that what is the importance of the nitrogen. Nitrogen is a key component of the bodies of living organisms, and nitrogen atoms are found in all proteins and DNA. So, the first important point, that it is a key component of the bodies of living organisms. Secondly, nitrogen atoms are found in all proteins and DNA. Nitrogen exists in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas, and in case of nitrogen fixation, bacteria convert nitrogen into ammonia, a form of nitrogen which is usable by plants. So, for the fixation of the nitrogen, it is the bacteria which convert nitrogen into ammonia which is used by plants. So when animals eat the plants, they acquire usable nitrogen compounds. So indirectly, it goes into the body of the human being by eating these very plants. So nitrogen is a limiting nutrient in nature. Now, what is a limiting nutrient? A limiting nutrient is the nutrient that's in shortest supply and limits the growth. Now, that very mineral, that very nutrient, which is required in very small quantity, but if it affects the growth maximally, it has a maximum effect on the growth, that we shall be discussing just after a few moments. And when fertilizers containing nitrogen and phosphorus are carried in runoff to lakes and rivers, they result in the blooms of algae, and we call that very process as eutrophication. So many times what we do, we just spray, we use fertilizers in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus, which are carried by the runoff and which reach the water bodies or lakes many a times, and that lead to the bloom of the algae. And that very process of the excessive nutrients in the water body, that very process is called eutrophication. Now, first of all, let us have a little bit of introduction about the nitrogen. Nitrogen is everywhere, and in fact, nitrogen gas makes up about 78% of the Earth's atmosphere by volume, and it is far much greater than that of the oxygen which we think of as air. So the air we breathe contains maximum amount of the nitrogen, even more than that of the oxygen which we think as a survival gas. So we animals and our plant, they don't have the right enzymes to capture or fix the atmospheric nitrogen. So in case of the animals and the plants, we don't have any such enzyme which can capture or fix the atmospheric nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere, the nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere. But even then, our DNA and protein, they contain quite a bit of the nitrogen, and even then our body has the nitrogen. Then from where this very nitrogen comes from? And when we talk about this nitrogen, it comes from the bacteria. The helping agents are the bacteria which gather, which fix this nitrogen for us directly or indirectly. Directly for the plants and indirectly for the animals. Now we shall be talking about the various steps in the nitrogen cycle. Now, what are the various steps in nitrogen cycle? The first step is nitrogen fixation. The second is nitrification. The third is nitrogen assimilation and mineralization. Fourth is ammonification, decomposition of nitrogenous compounds. And the fifth is de-nitrification. So we shall be talking about these very steps one by one, which are very important. So first of all, we shall be talking about the nitrogen fixation. Now, what is this very nitrogen fixation? It is the conversion of free nitrogen of atmosphere, conversion of free nitrogen of atmosphere into biologically acceptable form or nitrogenous compounds. That very process is referred to as fixation. Now, it is of two types. One is biological nitrogen fixation and other is physicochemical or non-biological nitrogen fixation. So, what actually happens? What actually happens is generalized in this very figure, that this very nitrogen, the nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere, that is taken up by the plants. We call it, and it is actually the bacterial fixation of air by rhizobium, azobacter, clostridium, and it is taken up by the plants. The plants, after death and decay, they form the dead organic matter, or the plant eaten by the animals, and then after their death and decay, they turn into the dead organic matter or the waste matter. And then this decomposition, it helps in the formation of the ammonia, which turns into nitrite ions and the nitrate ions, and which are again taken up by the plants, are released in the atmosphere again. Then first of all, we shall be talking about the biological nitrogen fixation. So in the nitrogen fixation, the first step or a part of it is the biological nitrogen fixation, or we say that a small part of the atmospheric nitrogen, that is nitrogen gas, is converted into biologically acceptable compound, that is ammonia, by organisms such as bacteria or blue-green algae, and the process is called as biological nitrogen fixation. Two groups of organisms are involved in this very process. Now, they can be symbiotic nitrogen fixers or they can be non-symbiotic nitrogen fixers. So, it means when we talk about the biological nitrogen fixation, it is actually the conversion of the nitrogen gas into acceptable nitrogenous compound, that is ammonia, by the biological organisms, that is bacteria, blue-green alga, and that is why it is called as the biological nitrogen fixation. And these very bacteria which convert nitrogen gas into ammonia, they can be symbiotic nitrogen fixers or they can be non-symbiotic nitrogen fixers. So when we talk about the symbiotic nitrogen fixation, some bacteria living symbiotically in the root nodules of the legume plants. So we all know that the legume plants contain the symbiotic bacteria in the root nodules, and they fix the atmospheric oxygen and make available for the plants, this very make available nitrogen for the plants, such as we do have the rhizobium species. So in this very topic, you don't get confused about the symbiotic and the non-symbiotic nitrogen fixation. Symbiotic nitrogen fixation carried out by the symbiotic bacteria, and those symbiotic bacteria mostly belong to rhizobium species. So it is the rhizobium leguminosarum, that is pea, rhizobium fascioli, that is bean, rhizobium lupine, that is the soya bean, or Bradyrhizobium japonicum, that is cowpea. So when we talk about the non-symbiotic nitrogen fixation, so there are several free microorganisms which fix atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. So they have the ability to fix the atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, and they are not symbiotic. That is why we call it as the non-symbiotic nitrogen fixation. And what do they do? Nitrogen fixing bacteria, they produce enzyme complex known as nitrogenase. They produce enzyme nitrogenase that convert nitrogen into the ammonia. So it is the formation of the nitrogen or conversion of the nitrogen into the form which is easily taken up by the plants, and that is ammonia. So when we talk further, when we try to know further that this nitrogenase enzyme is composed of two subunits, that is dinitrogenase, and it is MOFE containing protein. What is this? This is molybdenum iron containing protein, and dinitrogen reductase, that is iron containing protein. So one is dinitrogenase, which is molybdenum iron containing protein, and other is dinitrogen reductase, that is iron containing protein. So these two kinds of the enzymes, they are required to break down or to convert the atmospheric nitrogen into the form which is easily acceptable by the plants, and that is ammonia. When we talk about this very overall reaction of the atmospheric nitrogen fixation by the non-symbiotic bacteria, it is the absorption and reduction of the atmospheric nitrogen simply into ammonia. So many aerobic, anaerobic, and facultative anaerobic bacteria as well as blue-green algae can fix this very nitrogen non-symbiotically. Some non-symbiotic, that is free-living nitrogen fixers, are depicted here. So these very some of the bacteria which are non-symbiotic and help in the fixation of the nitrogen, they are, some of them are aerobic and some are anaerobic. Aerobic bacteria, they are azobacter, azomonas, and we do have the Beijerinickia, Dirksia, and among the anaerobic bacteria, we do have the Clostridium, we do have the D-sulfotomaculum, we do have the D-sulfovibrio, etc. So aerobic bacteria, they are Azobacter, Azomonas, Beijerinickia, then Dirksia. Then we do have the anaerobic bacteria, which are Clostridium, D-sulfotomaculum. Then we do have the D-sulfovibrio. Then there are certain, we call them as the photosynthetic bacteria, such as Rhodopseudomonas. Then we do have the Rhodomicrobium, and then we do have the blue-green algae, which are Nostoc, Anabina, Calothrix, Oscillatoria, etc. So many times the questions regarding these are asked in the examination, that which of the following is anaerobic bacteria, which of the following is aerobic bacteria, which of the following is photosynthetic, which is blue-green algae, and which of the following is a symbiotic nitrogen fixer, which of the following is a non-symbiotic nitrogen fixer. So you have to keep in mind these very names. Then we shall be talking about the non-biological nitrogen fixation. So atmospheric nitrogen react with oxygen during lightning and thundering to produce nitrogen oxide. So first of all, what happens? Because of the lightning, this very nitrogen, when reacts with oxygen, it forms the nitrogen oxide. Then this very nitrogen oxide get dissolved with rainwater, that is the rainwater, and fall to the ground. This very nitrogen gets mixed up with water, that is rainwater, and in the soil to form the nitrates and ammonium salts. So it is the nitrates and the ammonium salt. This is the ammonium, and then these are the nitrate salts. It can be NO3, that is nitrate, and NO2, it is nitrite. So one of the process that is, we call it as a Haber's process, and it is mainly asked in examination, that what do you mean by the Haber's process? It is actually the, when this very nitrogen, that is 2N2, when reacts with, in presence of high temperature, it reacts with hydrogen, that is 3 H2, it forms the ammonia. It forms ammonia. So what is Haber's process? The nitrogen and hydrogen when reacts at high temperature and pressure to form ammonia, this very process is called as the Haber's process. So this is the non-biological nitrogen fixation. Now, what do we mean by nitrification? The second step involved is nitrification. What is nitrification? The process of nitrification is especially important in soil because the transformation of the ammonium ion into the nitrate. The process of the nitrification is especially important in soil because the transformation of ammonium ions into the nitrate ions result in the change in the charge from positive to negative. So what happens in the case of the nitrogen fixation? This very nitrogen is changing the ammonium ions into the nitrate So this very process of the transformation of ammonium ion into the nitrate ion and changing its charge from positive to negative, this very process is called as the nitrification. So this very positively charged ions, it tends to bound with negatively charged clay particles in the soil, while the negatively charged nitrate ions tend to freely migrate in soil water so that plants can readily take up the nitrate ion by roots for assimilation into the organic compounds. So the biological formation of the nitrate and nitrite from ammonia is nitrification. So in a simple language, we can say that the biological formation of nitrate and nitrite from the ammonia, it is called as the nitrification. So nitrate is produced not only in soil but by nitrifying bacteria and in marine environment and sewage treatment plant. So nitrate is produced not only in the soil by nitrifying bacteria, but also it is formed in marine environment and the sewage treatment plants. So some chemoautotrophic bacteria are nitrifying bacteria which acquire energy from inorganic nitrogen compounds. There are two groups of nitrifying bacteria. One we call them as the ammonia oxidizer and other we call them as the nitrate oxidizer. So what happens in the case of ammonia oxidizers? These bacteria derive energy for cell synthesis by oxidation of ammonia and they convert ammonia into nitrite. So when they convert ammonia into nitrite, and we call them as the ammonia oxidizers, and the examples are nitrosomonas, nitrococcus, nitrospira and nitrosolobus. So the nitrate oxidizer, these bacteria derive energy by oxidation of nitrate. So when those very bacteria which derive energy by oxidation of the nitrite, we call them as the nitrobacter, and we also call them as the nitrate oxidizers. The third step, we call it as the nitrogen assimilation and mineralization. So when animal feeds on plants, nitrogen is deposited in the form of protein as well as converted into another form such as urea, uric acids and excreted as feces in urine. So similarly, some of the nitrogen compounds, they undergo mineralization and get deposited in the soil as ammonium salts. Inorganic nitrogen compounds present in the soil after nitrogen fixation, they are absorbed by the plants as nutrients and metabolize them for biosynthesis of amino acids, enzymes, nucleic acids, etc. So the process is known as nitrogen assimilation. Now, the fourth step is ammonification. We also call it as the decomposition of nitrogenous compounds. So, when dead remains of the plants and animals are decomposed by microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi, which are present in the soil, and they convert organic nitrogen compound into ammonia, we call such a process as the ammonification. Such as here in this very graphical representation, it is depicted that the plants and animals, they decompose, and the bacteria and fungi act on them, and um, they convert this very organic nitrogen into the ammonia. So this very process is called as the ammonification. So some of the bacteria such as Pseudomonas, Bacillus, Clostridium, Serratia, they convert this, among the bacteria, they convert this very organic nitrogen into ammonia, and among the fungi, Alternaria, Aspergillus, Mucor, Penicillium, Actinomycetes, Streptomyces can convert organic nitrogen compound into ammonia. The last step in the nitrogen cycle is denitrification. When we simply say the process of conversion of nitrate into nitrogen, it is denitrification. Let us now elaborate it. The biological conversion of nitrite, that is nitrite, and nitrate into nitrous oxide or molecular nitrogen gas, that is nitrous oxide, into nitrogen, that is atmospheric nitrogen. This whole process is actually called as the nitrate respiration and also denitrification. At first, what happens? The nitrite and the nitrate, they are reduced to nitric oxide and then to nitrous oxide and finally to molecular nitrogen. And this very denitrification, it causes loss of soil nitrogen into atmospheric. So this very process is responsible for the loss of the nitrogen from soil into the atmosphere. So this process is called volatilization of nitrogen. And denitrifying bacteria, these are basically anaerobes. Some examples of the denitrifying bacteria are Pseudomonas, denitrificans, Bacillus licheniformis, then Thiobacillus, denitrificans, then Hypomicrobium, and there can be other more such as Chromobacterium, etc. So there are many bacteria which help in the denitrification. And one of the process here, it is also called as anaerobic ammonium oxidation. Anaerobic ammonium oxidation, and that is why it is called as the anaerobic ammonium oxidation. And anaerobic ammonium oxidation, that is why many times it is also called as NMOX. So that is why it is most of the times called as NMOX as well, because it is taken from the anaerobic ammonium oxidation, that is NMOX. This very nitrogen cycle, it is a biogeochemical process which transforms the inert nitrogen present in the atmosphere to a more usable form for the living organisms. And the key role of the microbes in nitrogen fixation, that how our use of the nitrogen containing fertilizers can cause algal blooms. Many times you see that this is the excessive nitrogen in the water body that causes the algal blooms. Nitrogen and the phosphorus are mainly responsible for this eutrophication. That is, then there are three types of nitrogen fixation. Basically there are three types of the nitrogen fixation. One is atmospheric nitrogen fixation, other is industrial nitrogen fixation, and thirdly there is biological nitrogen fixation. So a phenomena where energy of lightning breaks the nitrogen into nitrogen oxide and then it is used by plants. This is basically the atmospheric fixation, wherein lightning helps in the breakdown of nitrogen into the nitrous oxide or nitrogen oxides that can be used by the plants. Then the second is industrial nitrogen fixation. It is man-made alternative that aids in nitrogen fixation by the use of ammonia. So it is the anthropogenic process. This is done by man, and ammonia is produced by the direct combination of nitrogen and hydrogen, and later it is converted into various fertilizers such as urea. So in industries, what is done? It is the man-made alternative that helps in the nitrogen fixation. Herein and ammonia is used and it is produced by direct combination of nitrogen and hydrogen. So how come this ammonia is produced? It is produced by the combination of nitrogen and hydrogen, and it is converted to various fertilizers such as urea. Then the third is biological nitrogen fixation. What happens in this very case? Nitrogen, as we know that the nitrogen is not usable directly from the air for plants and animals, but bacteria such as rhizobium and blue-green algae, they transform this unusable form of nitrogen into other compounds that are more readily usable, and these nitrogen compounds get fixed in the soil by these very microbes. So we do have the three types of the nitrogen fixation. And we all know that the bacteria, we have discussed it earlier as well, that bacteria play a key role in the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen fixing microorganisms, they capture our atmospheric nitrogen by converting it to ammonia, which can be taken up by plants and used to make organic molecules. And then the nitrogen containing molecules are passed to animals when the plants are eaten. They may be incorporated into the animal's body or broken down and excreted as waste such as urea as found in urine. Nitrogen enters the living world by the way of bacteria or by the help of the bacteria and other single-celled prokaryotes, which convert atmospheric nitrogen into biologically usable forms, and the process we discussed it as the nitrogen fixation. So some species of the nitrogen fixing bacteria, they are free living in soil or water, while others they are symbionts and live inside that of the plants, which we have discussed earlier. This is just a recap. And nitrogen does not remain forever in the bodies of living organisms. Instead, it is converted from organic nitrogen back to nitrogen gas by the bacteria. So these very nitrogenous compounds from the dead organisms or waste, they are converted into ammonia by these very bacteria, and the ammonia is converted into nitrites and nitrates. Ammonia is again converted into these very nitrites and nitrates, and in the end the nitrates are made into the is converted into the nitrogen gas by the denitrifying bacteria or denitrifying prokaryotes. There are various steps which are involved in the terrestrial land, such as we do have the atmospheric nitrogen. This is converted into ammonia, and nitrogen fixing prokaryotes, they convert nitrogen to ammonia, and this very ammonia is taken up by the plants, and the plants do flourish, and the plants, this very nitrifying prokaryotes, they convert ammonia to nitrites many a times, and nitrates which are again taken up by, which can be again taken up by the plants, and these very denitrifying prokaryotes, they convert nitrates to the nitrogen gas again, and it is again released into the atmospheric, and the animals, they get indirectly benefited from the plants when they eat the plants. In the past, scientists did not think that this nitrogen rich sedimentary rock was an important nitrogen source for the terrestrial ecosystems. However, new studies suggest that it actually is quite important, that these very sedimentary rocks, they are important sources of the nitrogen, and the nitrogen is released gradually to plants as the rocks wear away or withers, or the plants also get nitrogen from the rocks as a source. So far we have focused on the natural nitrogen cycle. It occurs in the terrestrial ecosystems. However, generally similar steps occur in marine nitrogen cycle as well. Their marine nitrogen cycle, there the ammonification, nitrification and denitrification processes are performed by the marine bacteria and archaea. Some nitrogen containing compounds fall to the ocean floor as sediment, and over long periods of the time these sediments get compressed and form the sedimentary rocks, and eventually geological uplift may move these very sedimentary rocks to the land. So similar kind of the mechanism takes place in the marine environment as well. So is nitrogen a limiting nutrient? How can we know that this very nitrogen is a limiting nutrient or not? So we today all know that nitrogen is a limiting nutrient. In natural ecosystems, many processes such as primary production and decomposition, they are limited by the available supply of nitrogen. In other words, nitrogen is often the limiting nutrient and the nutrient that is in the shortest supply, and thus limits the growth of the organisms or population. So we call those very nutrients as the limiting nutrient, which that are in the shortest supply but limit the growth of the organism or population. And now, what is the mechanism, or what are the factors by which we can know, okay, yes, this is a limiting factor? So when the nutrient is limiting, adding more of it will increase the growth. For example, it will cause plants to grow taller than the nothing is added. So that very nutrient, which if added more, the plants can grow taller. So if a non-limiting nutrient is added, it won't have an effect. For example, plants will grow to the same height whether nutrient is present or not. So if the nutrient is present or not and the plant is growing up to the same height, that is not a limiting factor. So for example, if we add nitrogen to half of the bean plants in the garden and found that they grow taller than the untreated plants, that would suggest that nitrogen was limiting. And the nitrogen and the phosphorus are two most common limiting nutrients in both natural ecosystems and agriculture. That is why if we look at the bag of the fertilizer, we will see that it contains lots of nitrogen and phosphorus, and mostly these, we all know that the NPK fertilizer, that is nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, that is mostly given to the plants because they are the nitrogen as well as the phosphorus, they are the limiting factors. Then human activity affects the nitrogen cycling. Most of the fixed nitrogen goes to make the fertilizers we use in our lawns, gardens and agricultural fields. We as human beings, may not be able to fix the nitrogen biologically, but we certainly do it industrially, as we have discussed earlier as well. About 450 million metric tons of fixed nitrogen are made each year by using a chemical method we call it as the Haber-Bosch process, in which nitrogen is reacted with hydrogen at high temperature, and that is the reaction which is used in industries to make the nitrogen for the plants, or the fertilizer for the plants in the form of ammonia, in the form of urea, that is ammonia containing substances. High levels of atmospheric nitrogen, other than this very we can say nitrite, they are associated with harmful effects like production of acid rain, nitric acid, and they contribute to the greenhouse effect as well, such as nitrous oxide. In general, we can say human activity releases nitrogen into the environment by two main means, that is combustion of the fossil fuels and use of nitrogen containing fertilizers in agriculture. So one is by the combustion of the fossil fuels and other is by the use of nitrogen containing fertilizers. Both processes increase the nitrogen containing compounds in the atmosphere. Now, what do we mean by eutrophication? As I had told you earlier, when the nutrients they increase in a water body, it causes eutrophication. So in this process, nutrient runoff, which causes our growth or the bloom of the algae or other microorganisms, and without the nutrient runoff, they are limited in their growth by availability of the nitrogen or phosphorus. And also, when we say, when artificial fertilizers containing nitrogen and phosphorus they are used in agriculture, excess of the fertilizers may be washed into the lakes, streams, rivers by surface runoff. The effect from the fertilizer runoff is salt water and freshwater eutrophication. So that is the eutrophication, that is excessive nutrients in water body. And this can cause death of other organisms living in the affected ecosystem, such as fish, shrimp, and result in the low oxygen species depletion, and such areas we call them as the dead zones. Because of the deficiency of the oxygen, the areas become the dead zones, and there is very less chances of the survival of the living organisms. Eutrophication can cause oxygen reduction in the oxygen availability in the water during night time, because the algae and the microorganisms that feed on them use up large quantities of the oxygen in the cellular respiration, and that is detrimental to the health of the other living organisms. So that was all about the nitrogen cycle, and next time we shall be dealing with the carbon cycle. Thank you very much. It is my request to you all to press the bell icon and subscribe the channel. Thank you.